This mini-lecture discusses acid-base reactions, including the definition of an acid and a base, the difference between strong and weak acids and bases, and how acids and bases participate in neutralization reactions. In many acid-base neutralization reactions, a hydrogen ion, or H+, provided by an acid reacts with a hydroxide ion, or OH-, provided by a base to form water, H2O. The cation from the original base and the anion from the original acid can also combine to form an ionic salt. And in this way, an acid-base reaction is basically another type of double displacement reaction, like precipitation reactions. As such, it is also possible for the ionic salt that is formed to be insoluble. So some acid-base reactions are also classified as precipitation reactions. The erupting volcano project from grade school, shown here on the right, is another example of an acid-base reaction that occurs via double displacement and forms water, although this example is a little different from the typical form shown above here. In this case, baking soda, also known as sodium bicarbonate, or NaHCO3, is used as the base and does not contain a hydroxide ion, but rather has the ability to accept a hydrogen ion from acetic acid. This represents another definition of a base, where the base doesn't need to include a hydroxide ion, but rather is able to accept a hydrogen ion. Vinegar, which is a solution of acetic acid, or CH3COOH, can act as the acid in this reaction. For the double displacement, we can consider the two anions switching places. The acetate anion, CH3COO-, in acetic acid is switching places with the bicarbonate ion, HCO3-, in sodium bicarbonate. And this forms a salt, sodium acetate, and carbonic acid, H2CO3. Where carbonic acid represents the bicarbonate ion now paired with the hydrogen ion from the acetic acid. We've seen previously that carbonic acid will rapidly decompose in water to form carbon dioxide, CO2, and water. So this is how the water is formed, and the formation of the carbon dioxide explains the bubbles that make the model volcano erupt when baking soda and vinegar are mixed together. As it turns out, we aren't actually quite ready to talk about the whole picture that is acids and bases, as it requires a discussion of equilibrium, a topic we won't get to until Chem 122. So for now, we're just introducing a few fundamental concepts that will be building blocks for the next Gen Chem class. The simple definitions of acids that we introduced earlier in the semester is called the Arrhenius definition, and it states that an acid is a substance that dissociates in water to produce hydrogen ions. Therefore, the general form of an acid dissociation reaction is written with HA, where H represents the hydrogen ion that will dissociate in an aqueous solution of the acid, and A represents the anion that dissociates from the acid and can be any nonmetal anion or polyatomic anion. So, for hydrochloric acid, A is just the chloride ion. However, a hydrogen ion on its own in water is incredibly unstable, as it is basically just a proton with a positive charge. Remember that a neutral hydrogen atom has just one proton and one electron. So if we remove the electron to create this H+ cation, then that leaves just a proton, which is why H+ is sometimes referred to as simply proton. A positively charged proton on its own in water is highly attracted to the partial negative charge on polar water molecules. So water molecules will arrange themselves around the proton in order to balance the positive charge, with their oxygens oriented towards the proton. We say that the proton is solvated by the water when the water molecules group up like this. A better way of showing this in the dissociation reaction for an acid is to show the acid reacting with a water molecule to form H3O+, which is referred to as the hydronium ion. This represents a water molecule that has accepted a hydrogen ion from the acid. It's important to note that this is still a simplification of what is actually happening in solution, but it is closer to reality than the simplified dissociation reaction shown above. However, both versions of the reaction are valid ways to depict the dissociation of an acid, and the second version is really important in second semester Gen Chem. Another acid-base term to be familiar with is deprotonated. An acid or molecule that is deprotonated has lost a proton or hydrogen ion, and its charge will have decreased or become more negative. So the chloride ion here is the deprotonated version of hydrochloric acid, and we see that it now has a -1 charge. As we saw in our previous discussion of strong and weak electrolytes, acids are considered electrolytes because they form ions in solution. But not all acids fully dissociate into ions. Those that do are called strong acids. In a solution of strong hydrochloric acid, the hydrogen or hydronium ions and the deprotonated anion, which is the chloride ion in this case, they will be the dominant species in the solution, and there won't be any intact HCl molecules as they will have all dissociated. Acids that only partially dissociate into ions in aqueous solution are called weak acids. Therefore, the dominant species in solution is the intact acid molecule because only a few of the ions are created. So in the case of weak hydrofluoric acid, most of the species in solution are the intact HF molecules, and only a few individual hydrogen or hydronium ions and fluoride ions will be present. There are 7 common strong acids that you should memorize. Some are binary acids and some are oxyacids, and many of these should look familiar from the nomenclature study sheet. Any other acids outside of these 7 are considered weak acids. One of these strong acids, sulfuric acid, is special in that it has more than one acidic proton and is therefore called a polyprotic acid. An acidic proton is a hydrogen ion that can dissociate from the acid. We can tell that sulfuric acid has 2 acidic protons as the molecular formula begins with 2 hydrogen ions. In fact, many oxyacids of polyatomic ions with negative charges greater than -1 are usually polyprotic, as their hydrogens are attached to the oxygens on the polyatomic ion, and the negative formal charge that is left behind when the hydrogen ion dissociates is stabilized by resonance in the polyatomic ion. This is easiest to see if you consider the Lewis structure of the polyatomic ion. Any oxygen with a -1 formal charge in the Lewis structure of the polyatomic ion indicates a prime location for an acidic proton in the oxyacid created from that polyatomic ion. When polyprotic acids lose these acidic protons, each successive acidic proton becomes more difficult to dissociate. So while the first acidic proton to leave sulfuric acid is considered to fully dissociate and therefore makes sulfuric acid a strong acid, the second acidic proton does not fully dissociate, and therefore the hydrogen sulfate ion, HSO4-, is considered a weak acid on its own. The Arrhenius definition of a base is a substance that dissociates in water to produce hydroxide or OH- ions. Therefore, the general form of a base dissociation reaction is written with MOH, where the OH represents the hydroxide ion that will dissociate in an aqueous solution of the base, and M represents the metal cation that dissociates. So for sodium hydroxide, M is just the sodium ion. However, as mentioned previously, another definition of a base is a substance that can accept a proton or hydrogen ion. This is called the Bronsted-Lowry definition of a base, and the only common one you should recognize at this point is ammonia. Note that if ammonia, NH3, is present in an aqueous solution, it can take a hydrogen away from a water molecule, forming the ammonium cation and the hydroxide ion. Again, it helps if you remember that water is just a hydrogen ion attached to a hydroxide ion. So if you remove the hydrogen ion from water, you are left with a hydroxide ion. Note that both definitions of a base produce a hydroxide ion in aqueous solution. This chart shows a list of some common weak and strong acids and bases. Note that strong bases are always metal hydroxides, specifically those that are soluble, as an insoluble metal hydroxide would not dissociate very much and therefore is not considered a strong electrolyte or strong base. Also, be careful about interpreting strong and weak to indicate how corrosive an acid or base is, as this has more to do with the reactivity of the elements in the acid and very little to do with how many molecules have dissociated to form ions. The most notable example is hydrofluoric acid, HF, which is a well-known weak acid, and yet it is extremely corrosive. Most notably, it is the acid that is used to dissolve a dead body in the excellent TV show Breaking Bad, and a few others. As we saw on the first slide, when an areneous acid and an areneous base are mixed, a double displacement reaction occurs. And here I've swapped the cations, creating a salt from the acid's anion and the base's cation. The double displacement also leads to a hydrogen ion being combined with a hydroxide ion, which just represents water. So we call this type of reaction a neutralization reaction, as it takes an acidic solution and a basic solution and neutralizes them by creating water. This will occur regardless of whether the acid or base is strong or weak, although you'll learn in Gen Chem 2 that not all neutralizations will yield a neutral pH, but that's a topic for the next class. Finally, as long as the salt formed in a neutralization reaction is soluble, then the salt ions are considered spectator ions, and the net ionic equation for the neutralization reaction is just the reaction between the hydrogen ion and the hydroxide ion to form water. This is commonly the net ionic reaction for areneous acid-base neutralization reactions, and it is determined by following the same sequence of steps as determining a net ionic reaction for a precipitation reaction. Keeping in mind that water has a liquid state label and therefore does not dissociate, but stays intact. This concludes the 5th mini lecture for Chapter 8. Please note any questions you may have about this material and how it is utilized to solve problems in the suggested end of chapter exercises and the sapling homework for this chapter. Please post any urgent questions on Piazza. I will also take questions on this material during one of our required class meetings, and during that time we will focus more on problem solving for concepts in this chapter.